Some stories refuse to fade, even when years turn into decades and memories begin to blur. Some names stay alive because the silence around them feels louder than any answer, and some disappearances leave behind questions that grow heavier with time instead of lighter. On April 20th, 1990, a 17-year-old boy named Christopher Matthew Kerze left his home in Eagan, Minnesota. He told his parents that he was sick and would stay home from school. He waited until the house was quiet. He took the family van, and he left behind a short handwritten note that would later become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in his case. The note said he would be back by 6 in the evening unless he got lost. The word lost was underlined twice. More than 30 years later, Christopher Kerze has never been found. No confirmed sightings have ever been verified. No remains have ever been discovered. No final answer has ever been given to the people who loved him most. This is not a rumor passed through the internet. This is not a story created for shock value. This case is real, documented, and still officially open. Tonight on Hidden Truth, we bring you a deeply researched and carefully told documentary story about a disappearance that refuses to be explained. A case that includes a disturbing letter mailed from another city. A case that includes an abandoned vehicle found in remote wilderness. A case that includes strange phone calls that began after the disappearance and stopped without warning. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to Hidden Truth. This channel exists for people who believe that missing individuals deserve attention even after decades. Every subscription helps keep real cases visible, discussed, and impossible to forget. Now stay with me, because what began as an ordinary spring day became a mystery that still has no ending. Christopher Matthew Kerze was born on February 19, 1973. And he grew up in Eagan, Minnesota, a suburban community south of St. Paul that was known for quiet streets, family homes, and a strong sense of safety. And people who lived there rarely imagined that a mystery like this would ever touch their neighborhood, because life in Eagan moved at a predictable pace. Children went to school, parents went to work, and serious crime was not something most families expected to face, and Christopher's life from the outside appeared to follow that same ordinary pattern. He attended school like other teenagers. He had friends in the area. He lived with his parents, and there is no public record showing that he was repeatedly running away from home or involved in serious criminal behavior. Which matters because understanding who Christopher was helps explain why his disappearance shocked everyone who knew him. And on the morning of April 20th, 1990, Christopher told his parents that he was sick and would stay home from school. And at the time, this did not raise immediate concern, because teenagers get sick and parents trust their children. And nothing about that morning suggested danger or finality. But later that day, when Christopher's parents returned home, they noticed something was wrong. The family van was missing, and inside the house they found a handwritten note left behind by Christopher. And the note said that something important had come up, and that he would be back by 6 in the evening unless he got lost. And what made this message deeply unsettling was the fact that the word lost was underlined twice. Because Christopher was not known for writing dramatic or emotional notes, and he did not usually underline words for emphasis, and this small detail suggested confusion, fear, or a deeper meaning that he did not explain. And 6 in the evening came and went, and Christopher did not return home, and as night fell, concern turned into panic. Calls were made to friends. Neighbors were asked if they had seen him, and no one knew where he had gone. And the following day, on April 21st, 1990, the situation became far more disturbing when Christopher's family received a letter that was postmarked from Duluth, Minnesota. And the letter stated that Christopher had lied about being sick in order to gain use of the van. And it said that he was going to not even he knew where, and most alarming of all, the letter claimed that he intended to end his life and apologize to his loved ones. And this letter instantly changed the direction of the case, because what had been a missing teenager now appeared to involve a possible suicide. But the details did not fully make sense, because authorities later confirmed that Christopher had taken a 20-gauge shotgun manufactured by O.F. Mossberg & Sons with him, but he had not taken any ammunition, and this single fact raised serious questions. Because if the intent was suicide, the lack of ammunition made no sense, and if the intent was simply to disappear, the wording of the letter suggested a final decision that conflicted with that idea, and investigators could not determine whether the shotgun had been discarded, hidden, or kept, and there was no evidence that it had ever been fired, and no signs of struggle were found. And at this point, Christopher Matthew Kerze was officially classified as a missing person under suspicious circumstances, and the people who loved him were left suspended between hope and fear, because the letter suggested one outcome while the evidence suggested another, and that contradiction would follow this case for decades, shaping every theory, every search, and every unanswered question that came after. On April 22, 1990, 2 days after Christopher Matthew Kerze disappeared, the family van was located abandoned near Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And this discovery immediately shifted the emotional weight of the case, because until that moment there was still hope that Christopher might simply return home. But the location of the van told a different story. Because Grand Rapids was not close to Eagan, it was surrounded by forest, dirt roads, and open wilderness. And it was a place where someone could disappear without being seen. And when law enforcement arrived at the scene, they found the van empty, undamaged, and parked without any obvious signs of struggle. There was no blood, no broken glass, no personal items scattered around, and no clear indication of what Christopher had done after leaving the vehicle. And this absence of evidence became one of the most frustrating elements of the case, because it offered no clear direction for investigators, and search efforts began immediately, with police officers, volunteers, and search teams combing the surrounding woods, fields, and nearby waterways, and helicopters were used to survey the area from above. And despite the intensity of these efforts, nothing was found. No clothing, no weapon, no personal belongings, and no trace of Christopher himself. And as days passed without results, the possibility that Christopher had intentionally walked into the wilderness began to be discussed. But this theory raised difficult questions, because the terrain around Grand Rapids is vast and unforgiving, and survival without supplies would have been extremely difficult. And yet no remains were ever discovered. And while investigators continued searching the physical landscape, the emotional landscape of the case grew heavier, because the family was left waiting without answers. And about 1 week after Christopher disappeared, something deeply unsettling began to happen, because his parents started receiving strange phone calls. And when they answered the phone, there was loud background noise on the line, noise that sounded like a party or a crowded gathering, with voices talking over each other, movement and confusion, but no one ever spoke directly to them. And every time they tried to ask who was calling, the line would suddenly disconnect. And these calls were not isolated incidents, they happened multiple times. And even more disturbing was the fact that Christopher's neighbor and best friend also began receiving similar calls with the same loud background noise and the same sudden hang-ups. And this detail made the situation even more troubling, because it suggested the calls were intentional and targeted. And Christopher's mother later stated that they had never experienced anything like this before his disappearance, and she firmly believed that the calls were coming from her son. And while investigators could not confirm this belief, they also could not explain the calls, because phone records did not lead to a clear source, and no voice was ever identified. And after approximately 6 months, the calls stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind more questions than answers. And during this time, posters were distributed across Minnesota and beyond, and Christopher's face appeared on missing person flyers in stores, schools, and public spaces. And despite the increased visibility, no confirmed sightings were reported. And as months turned into years, the case began to cool. Not because it was forgotten, but because there were no new leads to follow. And investigators were forced to revisit the same questions repeatedly, such as why Christopher would drive so far from home, why he would abandon the van without taking supplies, why he would write a letter suggesting suicide while leaving behind evidence that contradicted that idea, and whether the phone calls represented a sign of life or a cruel coincidence. And the lack of answers turned the van into a symbol of the case itself, a clear, physical object that led nowhere. And even decades later, the image of that empty vehicle parked in the wilderness remains one of the most haunting aspects of Christopher Kerze's disappearance, because it marks the last confirmed place he was known to be. And beyond that point, everything fades into uncertainty. In 1993, 3 years after Christopher Matthew Kerze disappeared, his face appeared before millions of people in a way that no one in his family ever expected, because the alternative rock band Soul Asylum released the song Runaway Train, and the music video for that song featured real missing children and teenagers from across the United States, and Christopher was included in the American version of the video. And for many viewers, his image was just one among many faces shown briefly on the screen. But for his parents and loved ones, it was a painful confirmation that he was still missing and still officially unaccounted for. And the video carried a powerful emotional weight, because it forced viewers to confront the reality that these were not fictional stories, but real people who had vanished. And after the release of the video, there was renewed public interest in Christopher's case, and tips began to come in from different parts of the country, and investigators carefully reviewed every lead that appeared credible. But none of them led to confirmed sightings or concrete evidence of Christopher's whereabouts. And while the exposure brought attention, it did not bring answers. And as years passed, the image of Christopher in the runaway train video became one of the most recognizable representations of his case. and it also created a lasting association between his disappearance and the idea of a runaway, even though investigators never officially classified Christopher as a runaway. And this distinction mattered, because the letter he mailed suggested despair while the lack of physical evidence suggested uncertainty. And as the case continued to age, it began to be discussed in early online forums and later in internet communities where people debated possible explanations. And some believed Christopher had intentionally disappeared to start a new life, while others believed the suicide letter was staged to mislead authorities, and some believed that something happened to him after he left the van, and that the truth was lost in the wilderness. And despite the wide range of theories, none were supported by verified evidence, and law enforcement repeatedly emphasized that speculation could not replace facts. And in 2004, the Eagan Police Department received an anonymous letter that once again stirred emotions around the case, because the letter suggested that police should stop searching for Christopher and claimed that he would return home when he was ready. And this message briefly raised hope for the family, but investigators were unable to authenticate the letter, and after reviewing its contents they concluded that it was most likely a hoax. And this decision was devastating because it reinforced the painful pattern of false hope followed by disappointment. And as the years continued to pass, Christopher parents remained vocal about their desire for answers, and they continued to cooperate with investigators and media outlets whenever the case resurfaced, and they consistently stated that they believed Christopher could still be alive. And this belief was strengthened by the lack of physical evidence confirming his death. And yet it was also challenged by the passage of time and the absence of any verified contact. And the emotional toll of living in uncertainty became a defining aspect of the case, because the family was forced to exist in a space between mourning and waiting. And as technology advanced, investigators revisited the case using modern tools, but the core problem remained the same. There was no confirmed activity linked to Christopher after April 1990, and no financial records, no employment records, and no medical records could be tied to him. And this absence made it increasingly difficult to determine whether he had survived beyond the initial disappearance. And still the case refused to disappear entirely, because it continued to resurface in documentaries, news articles, and missing person databases, and each time it did, the same questions were asked again. Why Christopher chose that day, why he chose that location, and what he meant by the word lost. And the truth is that even after decades of attention and investigation, the answers remain hidden. And Christopher Matthew Kerze became more than just a missing person. He became a symbol of unresolved mystery, a face known to many but understood by none, and the exposure that once brought hope ultimately highlighted the most painful reality of all, that being seen by the world does not guarantee being found. As the years passed and Christopher Matthew Kerze remained missing, his case did not disappear into silence as many others had, because his family refused to let his name fade, and investigators continued to revisit the details whenever new opportunities appeared. And this persistence became especially visible in the years following major developments in other Minnesota cases. Because when long unsolved disappearances were finally resolved, it reminded both the public and law enforcement that time does not always erase truth. And in late 2016, renewed attention returned to Christopher case after the resolution of the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling, which reignited public discussion around missing children and teenagers in Minnesota. And this renewed focus led to fresh media interviews, new articles, and a new wave of interest from people who had never heard Christopher's name before. And during this period, law enforcement worked with specialists to create age-progressed images showing what Christopher might look like as an adult, because more than 2 decades had passed since his disappearance, and any future recognition would depend on imagining him far beyond the face shown in the runaway train video. And these new images were distributed through missing person networks and shared with the public in the hope that someone might recognize him. And Christopher family once again stepped forward to speak openly about their experience, describing the pain of living without answers and the constant tension between hope and grief. And they emphasized that the lack of physical evidence confirming death kept them believing that Christopher could still be alive somewhere. And this belief was not based on denial but on facts, because despite extensive searches, no remains had ever been found, and no confirmed evidence had ever proven that Christopher had died. And as technology advanced, investigators revisited the case using improved databases and digital tools, but the central problem remained unchanged. There was still no confirmed activity tied to Christopher after April 1990. No financial records, no employment history, no medical records, and no verified identity matches. And this absence created a painful paradox, because it suggested either a complete break from society or an event that erased all traces at once. And during this time, online discussions continued to grow, with people across forums and communities debating the meaning of the letter, the significance of the underlined word, lost, and the unexplained phone calls that had occurred months after the disappearance. And while these discussions kept the case alive, they also created noise that made it difficult to separate speculation from evidence. And law enforcement repeatedly stated that theories without proof could not guide an investigation. And in 2025, Eagan Police Detective Angela Casey, who was leading the missing person investigation, spoke publicly about the case and reaffirmed the department commitment, stating that there had been many searches and that their dedication showed a message to the community that they do not give up easily. And this statement carried weight because it confirmed that Christopher case was not closed or forgotten, and even after decades it remained active in spirit, if not in daily investigation. And for the family, this commitment mattered deeply because it meant that Christopher's name was still spoken, still recorded, and still treated as a real person rather than a statistic. And yet the passage of time continued to raise difficult questions, because Christopher would now be in his 50s, and the longer a person remains missing, the harder it becomes to locate them without a single verified trace. And this reality forced investigators and loved ones alike to confront the possibility that answers may never come, and still they continued to search. Because hope in this case was not built on optimism alone, but on the unresolved nature of the evidence. And the story of Christopher Matthew Kerze became one of endurance, not only of a mystery that refused to be solved, but of people who refused to stop caring. And as long as his name remains spoken and his case remains documented, the possibility of truth remains alive, even if it has yet to reveal itself. As the years continued to pass, and Christopher Matthew Kerze remained missing, the unanswered questions surrounding his disappearance began to take on a life of their own, because every detail that lacked explanation became a point of focus for investigators, family members, and members of the public who encountered his story. And one of the most persistent questions centered on the handwritten letter mailed from Duluth, Minnesota, because no one could fully explain why Christopher would choose that city to send such a message, or how he traveled there so quickly, or whether the letter truly reflected his intentions at the time it was written. And some investigators considered the possibility that the letter was written in a state of emotional distress without a clear plan, while others questioned whether the wording was meant to mislead or protect someone else. And the fact that the letter included an apology but lacked specific details added to its mystery, because it suggested finality without providing closure. And another question that refused to fade involved the underlined word lost in the note left at home, because that single emphasis seemed deliberate. And people close to the case have debated whether Christopher meant being physically lost, emotionally lost, or something else entirely. And this ambiguity has never been resolved. And the unexplained phone calls that began approximately 1 week after the disappearance added another layer of uncertainty, because the calls appeared intentional, repeated, and directed toward people closest to Christopher. And yet no voice was ever identified and no source was ever confirmed. And investigators could not determine whether the calls represented a sign of life, a cruel coincidence, or an unrelated event. And the fact that they stopped suddenly after several months only deepened the mystery. And questions also remain about the shotgun that Christopher took with him, because its absence of ammunition contradicts the letter content, and no confirmed evidence has ever shown where the weapon ended up. And this missing detail has prevented investigators from drawing clear conclusions about his intentions. And beyond these specific elements, there is the broader question of how a 17-year-old could disappear so completely without leaving a trail, because Christopher did not use financial systems, did not appear in employment records, did not seek medical care under his name, and did not surface in any confirmed identity databases. And this absence suggests either a deliberate and sustained effort to remain hidden, or an event that ended his life quickly and quietly, and neither explanation can be proven with the available evidence. And as the case aged, it began to represent something larger than one disappearance, because it highlighted the limitations of investigations when physical evidence is scarce and time works against memory. And for Christopher family, the questions have never been theoretical, because each unanswered detail represents another day of living without certainty. And they have repeatedly stated that not knowing is more painful than any single confirmed outcome. And this emotional reality has shaped how the case is remembered, because it is not defined by a dramatic conclusion but by an enduring absence. And even today, when the name Christopher Matthew Kerze appears in missing person databases, it carries the weight of decades of unanswered questions. And those questions continue to matter, because they represent a life that did not simply vanish from memory. And as long as the evidence remains unresolved and the story remains documented, the possibility of truth remains present, waiting for a moment when one piece finally connects and brings clarity to a mystery that has refused to disappear. The story of Christopher Matthew Kerze is not an internet legend or a fictional mystery, but a real documented case that has been recorded and preserved through verified public sources, including the Wikipedia article titled Disappearance of Christopher Kerze, reporting by KSTP News based in Minnesota, reporting by KARE Television, documentation from the Charlie Project Missing Persons Database, records from the DOE Network Missing Person Profile for Christopher Matthew Kerze, and public statements made by the Eagan Police Department and Detective Angela Casey between 1990 and 2025, all of which confirm that Christopher Matthew Kerze was born on February 19, 1973, disappeared on April 20, 1990 from Eagan, Minnesota, had his family van located abandoned near Grand Rapids, Minnesota on April 22, 1990, and has never been found or officially declared deceased, and these sources also confirm the existence of the handwritten note left at home, the letter mailed from Duluth, Minnesota, the unexplained phone calls received by his parents and neighbor, and the inclusion of Christopher Kerze in the American version of the Runaway Train music video by Soul Asylum. And taken together, these verified records establish that this case is real, unresolved, and still officially open, and beyond the facts and timelines lies the human truth of the story, because Christopher Matthew Kerze was not a headline or a statistic, but a 17-year-old boy whose life was interrupted without explanation. And for more than 3 decades, his family has lived with unanswered questions that never lose their weight. And the absence of a clear ending has turned his disappearance into something more than a cold case. It has become a reminder of how fragile certainty can be and how easily a life can vanish without leaving answers behind. And this is why stories like this matter, because attention keeps memory alive. And memory keeps the possibility of truth alive. And if you believe that real people should never be forgotten, and real mysteries deserve real attention, then now is the moment to subscribe to Hidden Truth, because this channel exists to give voice to the forgotten, to document the unanswered, and to tell real stories with care, respect, and depth. And your subscription is not just a click, but a commitment to truth, to awareness, and to the belief that even after decades, silence does not have the final word. And this has been Hidden Truth, where real stories remain visible, real questions remain alive, and the search for answers never truly ends.